finance costs, includes your holding costs, a huge portion of your feasibility. And it's, the cost to get finance for development is no longer cheap. Back in the day when you could get first tier lending, and it was a lot cheaper, but then you have to get a whole lot of pre-sales. However, if you're talking about commercial lending, and if you ever have to go down the path of private lending, very easily you're looking at all up, including establishment costs and everything, 10-11% per annum on your total borrowing. And that's a hefty amount. If you're borrowing $1 million, that's 100,000. You've got a fair chunk of money there. So make sure that that you don't go slim on what your interest rate is. I've seen people sort of say, yep, it's 6% or whichever. Great if you're doing sort of pure residential lending. If you're going down the commercial path, it's going to cost you more. And you've got to take into account establishment fees. There's going to be line fees. Exactly what Moss said about, you've got to account for your QS reports and your valuations. They're all a few $1,000s a pop. So, and then the legals. And the legals not only for the finance, but the legals for your construction, JV agreements, any new entities that you're setting up. These all have to be factored into as well.
Definitely. And I think holding costs are one of the key areas of risk, especially from JV partners' perspective, right? Every time you see major risks, from a side perspective, you would see that people do play around with holding costs because people don't understand how they're calculated. It's such a complex calculation, right? When you talk about 11% lending, understand that, a lot of this lending is basically drawdowns based. And so, the effective rate might be different. So it's important to understand how they are calculating some of these numbers in the background too. People call out 6% effective rate or 7% effective rate on a commercial loan. And so gone are those days. They are old days now. These are not new rates anymore where you can get an effective, construction cost at, 6 or 7% anymore. So, and again, holding cost is the biggest factor that can make or break the site as well. And so, the longer you hold the site, the more draining you're draining the profit out of the development, right? So understand, some of these intricacies as well, that if there is an overlap of holding cost changing or you're draining and holding this longer, you are basically, exposed to, lower profits because, that's, I call this a continuous leakage of money. So yeah, it's important that, when you're assessing the sites, you are taking good care of some of these things too.
Yeah, I was going to say, if there's any time that you want to be taking longer when you're in a project, it's what you want to probably do it at the very beginning because you're not drawing down on your loan as much, right? Because that, like Moss said, it's not throughout the whole term of the loan that you're paying, 10-11%. You're right. It is there's drawdowns. It's sort of an S curve. At the end of your project where you are at pretty much peak debt, that is that point where you do not want to be dilly-dallying because that is when you are fully drawn on your loan and that's when you are paying maximum amount of money. That's when you want to get it moved on as quickly as possible. Right at the very start, only sort of drawing on a little bit of the money. So if you dilly-dally a bit there, you sort of go, yeah, it's costed me a little bit. But then if you're fully drawn at $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, $10 million on month 18 of your project, you want to be moving on that pretty quickly.
100%. I mean, especially if you think about bigger loans, right? If you think about $3 million worth of loans, right? I call this burn rate, and a lot of people don't think about this. I'm a data person, so a lot of these numbers, naturally makes a lot more sense. If you think about $3 million of total debt or exposure that you have, and if you're sitting at 11% and you are at your total exposure, you're basically burning $1,100 a day, compounded daily. Like imagine that, right? So every week that you are, waiting or losing is basically $7,700 compounded, probably $8,000 down the flush, $8,000 in the flush, gone, right? So it's very, very important that, you're planning the exit as fast and smooth as possible. And so you're not wasting time in, trying to chase that extra 10 or 20 or $30,000. The exit is the key when you are total, at the total exposure. So,
and that's a good segue into sales and marketing, because you want to get these out, out the door and out the window as quickly as possible.